Welcome back to the Diet Doctor Podcast. I'm your host, Dr. Brett Scher. Today I'm joined by two special guests, Doctors David Raubenheimer and Dr. Steven Simpson. And they are basically bug biologists in Australia. And as we talk about, it's pretty remarkable that these two bug biologists throughout their career have made some amazing discoveries that apply to the basis of human nutrition. And what I mean by that is they discovered the protein leverage. And as we talk about the protein leverage hypothesis, that we are basically genetically hardwired to eat enough food until we reach a protein target. But here's what's interesting. As we talk about in this interview, the protein target isn't always the same. It changes with age, and it can change also with environment, and we can change it ourselves sort of based on our goals and our lifestyle. And the basis of this hypothesis or this biological finding of protein leverage is that too little protein is a bad thing, right? In the sense that it's going to stimulate us to overeat calories to get enough protein. But does that mean that more protein is always better? Well, Steve and David, as you'll hear, think that more protein is not necessarily better. And they're pretty big advocates that too much protein leads to lower longevity. That's what they found in a lot of their bug data, whether it was locusts and also in their rodent data with mice. But the question that I have is, how does that then apply to humans? Humans are in a different environment, right? If we have insulin resistance and we're obese and we're living in a world where we're stimulated by constant food supply, we need to find a way to eat that's going to appease our appetite, lower our hunger, and benefit our metabolic health. And protein plays a big role for that. So how do you take that and balance it against some of this observational data and animal data that suggests too much protein is bad for longevity? Very interesting question that doesn't have an easy answer. And I think part of the problem is we try to just put it in the bucket, protein's bad for longevity, eat less, and therefore you'll live longer, end of story. And it's not so clear. And so we sort of get into that discussion. And although we may not agree on all points, I really appreciate their approach. They're very thoughtful. They know the science well, and they understand that things change over time. But the overall nature of this discussion is about protein leverage, how it applies to us as humans, and how is it related to the obesity epidemic, and what can we do about it? How can we take this knowledge of biology, apply it to our environment and our everyday life to try and be healthier, both as individuals and as a society? And so you can see, as we discussed, we talk a lot about their book, Eat Like the Animals. I'm a big fan of this book. I highly recommend it. I don't usually push books necessarily on this podcast, but I think this one is worth reading. And they also have another one called Nature of Nutrition, which I have to admit I haven't read, but I will definitely go out and get them because I'm a big fan of the two professors. So enough of that introduction. I hope you enjoyed this podcast talking about protein leverage. Doctors Raubenheimer and Simpson, thank you so much for joining me today on the Diet Doctor Podcast.
A pleasure, Brett. It's a pleasure.
You're coming in all the way from Australia. I don't think we could really get much further apart with me being in California and you being in Australia, but it is wonderful that we're able to make the time for this. And I'm such a big fan of your work with the protein leverage hypothesis and what this means for us humans. But I remember reading something that you wrote that people were shocked that two bug scientists created something or discovered something that was so pertinent to human nutrition. And it was almost like an insult that the human nutritionists and the people studying all this had missed something that two bug scientists came up with. And you were sort of self-deprecating, I think, as you described that. But tell us a little bit, if you can summarize I know it's such a big topic, but in a couple of minutes, summarize the protein leverage hypothesis and how it sort of came to be that you found it.
Well, no, you're exactly right, Brett. And there's a story we recount in the book. I gave a talk at Cambridge University in 2005, soon after the publication of the original protein leverage hypothesis paper, where a very eminent colleague came up to me afterwards and said exactly what you said. He also admitted to having sat on the review of the paper for more than 6 months because he was so affronted that two bug scientists had come up with something that he and others in the field feel they should have noticed. And he said very generously at the time, I hope you understand that this is very difficult for us, but I think you're right. So that was one of those wonderful occasions in one's career where you've really pushed against the prevailing view of things. You've come in from an outside position, and yet you have some sort of affirmation from a senior figure in the field. But it stemmed back to the work that David and I did initially together in Oxford, working on insects, working on locusts, an animal that we'd been studying, and I'd started studying as a PhD student around appetite control. I wanted to know why locusts eat when they eat and how much they eat, and the understanding of the control of appetite was a really interesting problem, biologically very interesting. And then emerging out of that early research came the realization that locusts aren't just hungry for anything, they're hungry for specific nutrients, and demonstrating that there were specific nutrients for at least two of the macronutrients at that time, protein and carbohydrate. And David arrived in Oxford, and we started to work together on the notion of appetites competing with one another. And it was emerging out of that early work that we discovered that indeed appetites can either work together to guide animals to optimal diet choices, or in suboptimal nutritional environments, they're going to compete. And in our locust systems, protein won that competition. And really from there, everything followed.
Yeah, we came into that research, into human nutrition research, as Steve said, from a very different perspective. We had the advantage of being biologists and looking at the diversity in the natural world. And the obvious question that arose to us is, how is it that all these other species are so damn good at selecting a balanced diet? And why does our species not do the same? So the research that Steve's speaking to was addressing the how do other species do this question. And of course, we found they have separate appetites that interact and work together to enable them to balance their intake of nutrients in an appropriate food environment.
If you go back to, let's say, Charles Darwin and his work on Galapagos finches, a strange group of birds and a strange group of islands. But if you look in the right way at a particular system, which may have nothing to do with humanity directly, you can come up with insights that actually can really profoundly change the way that you understand human biology. So for us, locusts were our Galapagos finches, if you like.
Yeah, that's a great analogy. And I like how you mentioned that you were outsiders. And frequently it takes an outsider without sort of the preconceived notions and biases to come in and shake up and discover things, which I think is exactly what you did. And your book is wonderful, how it goes through the whole process of starting with locusts and the nutritional geometry, and how you waited anxiously for your results because it could have been months and months of work to find no results, but that each time you found that sweet spot, that no matter what the locusts were eating, whether they were eating on their own or whether they were being fed certain diets, they kind of always gravitated towards the same amount of protein. And so you talk about the different appetites, and you mentioned that there are 5 appetites, but it seems like protein is key, and there's protein, fat, carbs, sodium, and calcium. But I'm curious why you think protein rises to the top. Why is it that people will, or I guess the animals and presumably people as well, will prioritize protein over those other appetites?
One really important answer to that is that we don't have a protein storage capacity like we do a fat storage capacity. And that means 2 things. It means, firstly, that on a daily basis, we need to ensure that we satisfy our protein requirements. So we need to ensure that we get enough. The other thing that it means is that if we overeat protein, there's no opportunity to store it for the future. Now, fat and carbohydrates are very different in both of those respects, and that gives human biology less latitude over our protein intake than what it does over fat and carbohydrate intake.
The other critical thing, obviously, about protein is not only is it an energy-yielding nutrient, like fat and carbohydrate, the other 2 macronutrients, but it also contains nitrogen, and you need nitrogen to build just about everything. Reproduction requires nitrogen. So too does growth. So too does all the essential functions of cells and cellular maintenance require nitrogen in the form of proteins that ultimately come from the diet. Where unlike some other organisms in the world that can take atmospheric nitrogen and fix it and then use it to build their own nitrogenous tissues, we can't do that. We rely on it to come from our diet. So protein is the principal source of nitrogen in our diet. Hence, it has this double importance, and coupled to the fact that we don't store it in any large separate storage organ, that means that it really becomes of great priority to us. And the other interesting thing about it is that amongst the three macronutrients, it's actually the minor one in terms of contribution to energy. So 15-20% of our diet comes, our calories in our diet comes in the form of protein, and yet it's also an essential macronutrient. And that combination gives it enormous leverage. And the leverage comes from the fact that if you want to get enough protein, you've got to eat a whole lot more or a whole lot less of everything else in the diet, depending on its concentration in the diet. And therein lies the heart of the protein leverage hypothesis.
Inherent in what Steve has been saying, that it's also, of course, a dual-purpose nutrient compared to fats and carbohydrates, in the sense can be used for structure and metabolic functions as well as in energy metabolism via gluconeogenesis, whereas, of course, fats and carbohydrates aren't that way. They don't have the nitrogen.
Right. They're not the structural component in the muscle building and the bones and everything. Yep. So that does make sense why we would want to prioritize that. Now, it is so interesting that that you showed so elegantly, if the locusts or the animals are fed a low protein diet, they will overeat calories to get the same amount of protein. And if they're fed a higher protein diet, they will undereat calories once they sort of reach that protein level. But now my next question is, why is it the protein leverage hypothesis? Why is it not the protein leverage proof or the protein leverage effect, or something that implies more certainty? Because when you read protein leverage hypothesis, I think a lot of people's first thought is, well, it's just a hypothesis. It's not proven. What's the level of evidence? So tell me about that. Like, why the word hypothesis, and how strong do you think the evidence is to support it?
So protein leverage itself is not a hypothesis. That's been demonstrated several times in independent labs, in randomized controlled trials. We now have population data indicating the same, reanalysis of literature data. Humans show protein leverage. The hypothesis is not around that. The hypothesis is around the role of protein leverage in driving the obesity epidemic. So it's an ecological hypothesis. It's not the biological hypothesis.
Yeah, that's a really important point. So the demonstration that there's a separate protein appetite, that's incontrovertible now, and it is universal to the extent that every species that's been looked at demonstrates a separate protein appetite. That's the thing you require. That's the first thing you require for protein leverage to occur. The second is whether or not that protein appetite dominates and hence leads to protein leverage. And that isn't universal. Some species, as we demonstrate in the book, actually show other forms of leverage where non-protein energy is prioritized over protein intake. But in our species and in a whole range of others that we've looked at, including some of our primate cousins, protein leverage does occur. So that's, I guess, incontrovertible as well. The question is, and the hypothesis, the only time we ever use that word is, as David said, in relation to whether that phenomenon has contributed to the obesity epidemic. And I would argue now that the evidence for that is near overwhelming as well. And it comes, as David says, from population level analysis of national survey data, clinical trials, experimental studies, smaller scale studies in the lab, meta-analyses of trials, et cetera, et cetera. It's now coming to the point, and we sort of brought the evidence together in 2019 most recently. I think you'd be brave to deny its existence now as a contributor to the obesity epidemic.
Yeah, well, I guess the counter argument, though, is if you were to say it's the case you make so well in your book, the ultra processed foods, the combination of carbs and fat devoid of protein, that we overeat those because we're trying to get to that certain level of protein, that it's our evolution pushing us to get that level of protein. Whereas it seems like maybe the critics would say, or maybe not even the critics, just some people would say, but in addition, those ultra-processed foods stimulate the reward center and stimulate us to eat more. So does it have to be one or the other, that maybe it's not the protein, maybe it's that they're being stimulated to eat more, or do you think it's just a combined effect?
Very much a combined effect. Yeah. Both are true, but we have controlled for that in our randomized controlled trials, in a systematic way, in a non-ultra-processed food environment, the percentage of energy contributed to non-processed meals from protein. So we've done that experimentally, and it's not just the effect that you're mentioning. The important effect that you're mentioning has to do with the interaction between two very important contributors to dietary intake. The one is what we choose to eat, and the other is how much of it we eat once we've chosen it. So ultra-processed foods, the effect you're mentioning, they feed into the first as well. They are what divert us from whole food diets because of the palatability of the mixtures that are produced industrially, and they're fine-tuned specifically to appeal to human taste and hedonic responses. And once we've chosen to eat a diet that is rich in low-protein, ultra-processed foods, protein leverage kicks in and ensures that we overeat fats and carbohydrates to stabilize protein intake. So that interaction between selection and how much we eat of what we've selected is a very important one.
And picking up on that, and we looked at this ourselves. If you actually measured the frequency of different foods in our modern food environment, and look at the extent to which we've been distracted or diverted away from our target protein intake, it's actually remarkably little in comparison with what it should be if you look at the superabundance of the ultra-processed, low-protein foods in our environment. To have only been diverted off course by a couple of % at most over the last 50 years towards a lower protein intake in the diet is pretty remarkable, and I think testament to the effectiveness of these regulatory appetite systems. But the problem comes from the fact, as we said earlier, that protein is the minor macronutrient. And if you dilute it by just a % or two, you're driving a 10% or more increase in total calorie intake to get to the same protein intake. And that is the heart of the protein leverage effect.
The other important thing is that there's huge variation within populations in the percentage energy contributed by ultra-processed foods to human diets. So in the United States, for example, we did an analysis. The average is 50%, and that's a huge amount for an average. But it goes right the way up to 80% in the highest fifth group. 80% of the diet is contributed by ultra-processed foods, right down to 30%. So that's a huge variation. And actually it tracks pretty well with what we know about the variation in obesity in relation to intake of ultra-processed foods.
Yeah, that's a very interesting answer. So basically what you were getting at is, if a percentage of protein was supposed to be around 18%, I guess is kind of the magic number. It seems like I don't know if you'd agree with that or not from your book, but if it only goes down to 13%, that's a simple 5% difference, which on the surface may seem like no big deal, but the amount of calories you need to overeat to make that up is related to how little protein is in your diet. So if you're in that 80% group, you could be eating 50% or more calories to make up for that. But if you're in the lower level of the ultra-processed foods, maybe it's fewer calories you need to overeat. So the baseline diet really plays into that. Is that a sort of a fair statement?
No, that's exactly right. In fact, if you go from 13 to 18%, or the other way around, 18 to 13%, that would drive an enormous increase in calories to attain the same absolute intake of protein. And it doesn't require that big a difference. Actually, when we looked at nutrient supplies over the last sort of 50, 60 years, it's probably at a population level only 1% or 2% that there's been a dilution of protein in the food supply. Yet that can drive still a 10% increase in total energy. It's sort of basic Euclidean geometry. If you do the maths, you'll see how much leverage changing protein has on total intake. And of course, in the other direction, if you concentrate protein in your diet, because our regulatory systems don't allow us to overconsume it substantially either, then you'll end up eating fewer calories than you need, and that potentially could support weight loss.
Right. So I definitely want to get into that. But when we're talking about the ultra-processed foods being devoid of protein and or being such a problem in our population, could a solution just be throw some whey protein, throw some pea protein into these processed foods, and then we satisfy the protein leverage hypothesis, or is it more complicated than that?
I think it's more complicated than that, because it's not just, well, firstly, it's not a carbohydrate is not necessarily, all carbohydrates are not equal. So highly refined, these foods are made from highly refined carbohydrates, highly processed carbohydrates. And the second thing is that it's not just the composition of the food, it's also the structure of the food that makes an important difference to the way that it interacts, our bodies interact with the food. So if you add powdered cellulose, powdered fiber to a diet, it's very different than eating a plant that has the structural component, the fiber making up the structural component. So it's a debate, and some people think, particularly the food industry, is confident that ultra-processed foods can be reformulated in a way that circumvents the problem, but it's a really complex challenge. And who knows, possibly technology in the future will enable that to be the case, but at the moment there's no evidence that it is.
It's an interesting and still open question. David's indicated there's a key element, which is fiber, dietary fiber, and hence overall caloric density of foods is an important part of the story as well, because that ultimately is an important part of the regulatory systems that have evolved to control appetite. But, it is a fair question. If you were to do what we've done in our locust and mouse studies, is to essentially have an ultra-processed diet where you manipulate the proportions of components, and you do get outcomes which can, if you titrate the nutrients, lead you to be overweight and metabolically healthy, overweight and seriously unhealthy, underweight and metabolically unhealthy as well. So that's the power of nutritional geometry, and it provides a way of thinking about how you answer that sort of question, Brett.
Yeah, I think that fits very well with what you said in your book when you were studying the locusts, that the locusts that got their protein amount in fewer calories, so they were eating higher protein food, were thinner and almost too thin to a point where they didn't start to fly until later. But those who had to overeat carbs, so to speak, to get that same protein amount were obese locusts. But when you change the quality of the carbs, then it wasn't so much, it had less of an effect on their overall health. So it's not just the amount of the food that they're eating, but the quality that they're eating as well. Does that sum it up right?
No, that's exactly right. And we have published tomorrow a major study. It's a mouse study, the largest that we've ever undertaken. And as you probably understand, we're fool enough to do huge mouse studies like the one we report in the book. What we've done is to really explore the interaction between protein and carbohydrate, looking into not only the background level of protein in the diet for mice, but also the nature of the carbs. And the results are actually quite remarkable. So we've reaffirmed very strongly, and we've reaffirmed, but other labs have done the same, of course, that if you, as a middle-aged mouse, have a lower percent protein in the diet, then you live longer, particularly when that's coupled to high concentration of carbohydrates. what we found is that beneficial effect of protein dilution in middle age and early late age it's amplified if you have digestion resistant starches, in other words, really complex carbs in the diet. And it's totally abrogated if you have the equivalent of high fructose corn syrup as your principal carbohydrate. And that turned out, so we titrated glucose and fructose as monosaccharides together in different ratios at different protein backgrounds. We had sucrose, we had native wheat starch, which is digestible, and we had resistant starch. And you got the worst possible combination of outcomes if you had low protein and high fructose glucose mixtures in a 1-to-1 ratio. That was the killer spot. So a low protein diet can either be profoundly healthy if it's a complex carbohydrate that it's mixed with, low carb, high complex carbs, or else it can be the worst if you're low protein, driven to overconsume calories because it's low in protein by protein leverage, and getting a bunch of 1-to-1 glucose fructose monomers together in your diet. And that seems to be the sweet spot for bad outcomes.
Which is exactly what we see if we look at global diets, the ranging global diets, the healthiest diets associated with the longest health spans, like the Okinawan, traditional Okinawan Japanese diet, Mediterranean diet, and others, Kittivan Islanders, all have that combination of low protein paired with complex starches compared to the processed food diet, which is low protein compared to highly refined carbohydrates.
But doesn't that then fly in the face of protein leverage? If the traditional Okinawans are reported to be eating or to have eaten 10% of their calories from protein, so that would suggest they should be driven to massively overconsume the carbohydrates, even though they're higher quality, higher fiber carbohydrates. Shouldn't they be eating 3,000, 4,000, 5,000 calories a day to try and get a higher percentage of protein? So how do you equate those?
Well, that's where you need to bring in the fiber component in the diet. So the principle, they have a highly energy dilute diet overall. And as we explain in the book, one of the best brakes on protein leverage is dietary fiber, and the complexity of carbohydrate in the diet and the association with various types of dietary fiber is, we think, likely the outcome there. And that's precisely what the mouse study is indicating.
So I think talking about the traditional Okinawans, which unfortunately is obviously very different now in that environment, but it brings up the concept of what is the baseline we're starting with? So if you're talking about someone eating 80% of their calories from processed foods versus somebody eating, 5% of their calories from processed foods, it's a wildly different story. But the question is, does the amount of protein still have to be basically the same between those two groups? And one of the reasons why I ask is, people focus on the benefits of protein for muscle maintenance, or the benefits of protein for metabolic health, or for weight loss. So there are lots of elegant studies out there showing that higher protein diets, up to 30, 35% compared to 20%, can help with blood sugar control, can help with weight loss, which suggests that more protein is better in many ways, but not in all ways. So how do you balance the drive to get enough protein with some potential benefits to more protein and also some potential concerns to more protein? It sounds like, we're trying to juggle too many balls to really come up with a conclusion. So give us your thoughts on that.
Well, the word balance is crucial, I think, Brett. The idea that more protein is good, therefore even more must be better, flies in the face of what nutritional geometry has demonstrated. And it's axiomatic to everything that we've discovered, that there's an issue where things have to be traded off. There are costs and benefits. Too little is bad, too much is bad. There's a balance. There's what we call the intake target, is that sweet spot. And that sweet spot will change. And that's something that isn't entirely as well appreciated as we think it should be. And it isn't reflected, for example, in national dietary guidelines, which assume the same diet quality across the life course. So that's the first part to the answer. We've shown, and we do so in the book, that as you go through life, your protein target and your non-protein energy mixture will change. And it will change, obviously, profoundly from the point where you enter the world and you're feeding on the perfect diet for you as a newborn is breast milk. It's only 7% protein, high in fat and carbs, and that combination is perfect for you as an infant, but it would be catastrophic for you in midlife. But as you go through your adolescence and become an adult and go through your reproductive years, pregnancy, if you're a woman, your protein needs will be higher. But when you get past that into your late 30s and 40s, all the evidence that we've discovered both experimentally and at population level is indicating that reducing protein intake and increasing healthy carbs is going to have the best outcomes in terms of age-specific mortality and disease risk. So these things, and then when you get to your later years, you start to become really quite inefficient in the way you handle protein. So in your old age, you need to increase your protein intake again because your target has gone up. And if you don't, then you're going to suffer problems of sarcopenia and muscle wasting. So all of those things, that's a really important component to the story, that our requirements change as we go through life and one size doesn't fit all. Now, you add to that, of course, differences in lifestyle. If you're a bodybuilder, if you're an elite athlete, we give some examples in the book there, then your protein target is higher because you have a higher requirement for it. So all of that is part of the answer to why protein levels may be required differently at different stages throughout one's life.
Our interest isn't in advocating diets, but it's in understanding diets. And of course, diets are an individual choice as well. And if what you want out of your diet is large muscle mass and the things associated with very high protein diets, that's an important thing to take into consideration. But really important also to be aware that in the longer term, there might be health and metabolic consequences to that, as our research shows, in relation to the reduction in lifespan and health span associated with high protein midlife diets.
And I think picking up on it, there's another really crucial distinction that's worth drawing, and it speaks to the point you made about increasing protein in the diet may be good for weight loss and for resetting blood sugars. Now that's clearly the case, and we understand why, and protein leverage explains part of the reason why. But it's important to make a distinction between a therapeutic dietary intervention and a habitual population healthy diet. And sometimes we feel that is getting a little bit confused. And maybe an example would be, a defibrillator is a very useful device if you're suffering a cardiac arrest, but you wouldn't use it as part of your normal healthy heart regime. So distinguishing therapeutic from habitual healthy lifestyle diets, having remediated the problem through a dietary intervention, we need to be a little bit more sophisticated, I think, in thinking about those things. There's costs and benefits. The benefit from a higher protein diet in terms of weight loss and metabolic resetting is unanswerable, but it's only worth paying the costs if you need to do those things. Otherwise, you're unnecessarily remediating a problem that isn't there and just getting the downside, which is the costs that come with a higher than optimal, higher than target protein intake.
Yeah, it's very important points that as age changes, protein requirements changes, and as health conditions changes, protein requirements change. And to make a dietary guideline for everybody just seems a little absurd and unhelpful. So I think that was well said. Yeah. But you also brought up the terms lifespan and health span, which I think are so important to differentiate. And so one of the important points you brought up in your book was those who had the locusts, the bugs that ate fewer. I'm having a hard time specifying the bugs because I'm so used to talking about humans. But the locusts that ate less protein lived longer, but seemed to have less reproductive health. And those that ate more protein had more reproductive health and lived longer. Now, to my sort of simplistic thinking of this, to me that votes for greater health span or greater health if you look at reproductive health as a marker of the bug's overall health at the cost of longer lifespan, which if you translate to humans could be really important, because as we talk about lengthening life, what kind of life are we lengthening? Are we lengthening sort of frail and weak life or a more vibrant and healthy life? So when I talk about reproductive health as a marker of overall health, does that make sense, or do you see it a different way?
Evolutionary theory, the trade-offs are really important in evolutionary thinking and evolutionary theory, and the trade-off between lifespan and reproduction is a good example of that in life history theory. And the idea there is that if reproduction, the goal of a species is to reproduce, because that's how evolutionary adaptations take place, passing on genes into future generations. But that's dependent on the environment's capacity to support reproduction. So the theory is that in periods when the key nutrient for reproduction, protein, is available, then species and individuals will reproduce. They'll take advantage of the environment and reproduce. And reproduction comes with its costs. Those costs aren't fully understood. Part of them arise from the evolutionary dynamics that once you have reproduced, natural selection on your bodily adaptations is reduced in proportion to the extent to which your genes are out there in the population. So if you think, for example, if an individual reproduces early and passes on cancer genes, then those cancer genes are already out in the population. Evolution is reduced according to reproduction. The theory is that in periods when protein is not abundantly available in the environment, then what the body does is it adopts a different set of metabolic pathways that slows down progression through the lifespan, and that's associated not with the GO pathway, but it's this go slow pathway to do with repair and maintenance of metabolic processes within the body, and it's that is believed to extend lifespan on low protein diets.
So you sit it down and hunker down until the world gets better, and then when you get the opportunity, then reproduce. So it leads to this sort of trade-off between the two. As to what matters most, there's a lovely example we give in the book, where our first big study where we looked at what are the costs to eating different ratios of protein and carbs in the case of Drosophila, the little vinegar fly, the fruit fly, so beloved of geneticists for decades. So we did an experiment. We provided 28 different mixtures of protein and carbs and different concentrations. And we measured how much the flies ate, how many eggs they laid, and how long they lived, and then mapped those response landscapes and showed that if they're on a lower protein, high carb diet, they lived longest. But if they're on a higher protein, low carb diet, they laid more eggs. If you went to a really high protein diet, they neither lived longer nor laid many eggs. So there were different sweet spots. Then we asked the flies the question, what do you care about? What's your primary goal in life? Is it to live long or to lay as many eggs as you can? And to do that, we gave them different diet choices to allow them to make their own selection. Lo and behold, they chose the diet that maximized their reproduction, not how long they lived. So Darwin was right again. Now, when it comes to us, that's perhaps a different. It's a different formulation. What do we care about? I'd argue we care about living healthily and not living with profound illnesses of frailty into our really advanced age, but to live as healthily for as long as we can. So this is the notion of health span versus lifespan, minimizing the numbers of years that you're alive but unable to really enjoy being alive.
Right. And that's where I think it becomes a little challenging to really set that protein target. Again, for a population, very difficult to do. But even for individuals, depending on if they want to prioritize being more vibrant and healthy and active and energetic, and they're going to need a little bit more protein versus someone who maybe doesn't emphasize that as much, and they're going to need a little less protein. But does that sort of goes beyond the protein leverage then? Because it seems like protein leverage is almost like a set point. But does the protein leverage also change based on your baseline activities and your physical activity? And do you have to choose to eat more, or do you think you would also be sort of evolutionarily stimulated to eat more protein as well, the more active you are?
Well, your protein target changes over the life course, and leverage is with respect to your target. So that's the first thing. It's not a fixed set point across the life. It's relative to your protein target, and that will change. Now, the question is, it will change throughout your life course as part of your innate biology, and that's what's going to determine the extent to which you may have to try and manage or override biology. And that's really difficult to do, as we know. It may be that the protein target has evolved to follow a particular trajectory through your life, and your life goals may be somewhere else, and you may therefore need to manage your diet and fight to some degree, or at least work constructively with your biology to the extent that you can to achieve those goals. So that's really, actually, if you unpack it, it's a sophisticated question, and it has a quite complex answer.
Yeah.
We've thought a lot about it, actually.
Yeah. And of course, the target is not just with respect to protein, but also fats and carbohydrates.
Right.
And as energy requirements go up, we've shown in animal studies, both in the lab and in the field, the spontaneously selected diet changes to track those increased energy demands. So monkeys, for example, in China in the winter, when they have high metabolic costs for thermoregulation, for generating heat in the very cold winters, they select a diet during winter that's significantly and substantially higher in fats and carbohydrates, because that is what the thermoregulation requires, but the same in relation to protein. Or it's the same in lactation. So appetite systems are calibrated according to an animal's nutritional requirements. And that's an important indicator to us as humans, because we can then ask the question in humans, as we've asked in many other species, what is the diet that our appetite systems spontaneously select in an appropriate environment, one that's not polluted by high levels of ultra-processed foods and things that our appetite systems are not adapted to dealing with. And invariably, that diet seems to be about 15 to 18% of energy from protein, at least to the extent that the nutritional geometry analysis have been done on these, on that question. And that's a really important indicator as to what is the natural or the required nutritional balance for humans.
Yeah, and good that you brought up environment, because I think that is so important, and you devote a whole section in your book about environment, and the environment that you both have withstood, whether it's the lab, counting all the flies, or being out in the field in the plus 100-degree heat in the desert or high in the mountains, and the tracking these animals for days and weeks at a time. I mean, you've been through some crazy environments, but that's also part of where maybe the extrapolation to human data is maybe not as accurate, because the environment we are in is a completely different environment with too much food, too much low quality food, kind of all around us. And a lot of the times the biological processes sort of break down, and that's sort of a big part of the hypothesis that's why it's driving obesity, because of our environment. But then also, I guess I'm rambling a little bit, but also the concepts of satiety and the concepts of health, that maybe protein plays an extra role there. So again, it's that balance based on the environment that you're in. So do you have a hard time sort of extrapolating the locust environment to human environments and with how different they are, and saying that the protein leverage is equal among those situations?
The thing about studying natural environments is it helps you to better understand, and in our case, it's not just humans, but more broadly, primates and other species. It helps you better understand those biological mechanisms and what sorts of environmental dynamics they evolved to deal with. If you then look back to our current environments, our biology hasn't changed, the environment has changed. We get a much clearer perspective on what's going wrong. Our biology isn't broken. Our biology is intricately capable, like that of the other species that we study. What's changed is the environment in which that biology is interacting.
And you're exactly right, Brett. The key point of interaction is between our evolved biology, including our appetite systems, our multiple nutrient appetites in particular, and our nutritional environment. And the good news story is that we're not in a mess because we've broken our biology. We've hacked our biology, we've distorted our biology, we've diverted our biology off course, but it's still working. And the reason we've done that is because we've changed, as David said, our food environment so radically that biology is now no longer working for us as it evolved to do. It's now working for the processed food industries and, in fact, countermanding our better health. So that's the point where biology intersects the nutritional environment, and that's where all the action happens, and that's where the solutions have to lie. And the solution isn't to fix our broken biology. That still works. The solution is to fix our broken food systems.
Right. There are very few foods in nature that are designed specifically to be eaten. Most are designed not to be eaten. If you think of plants evolving not to be eaten, animals evolving not to be eaten, we've reversed that, and we've populated our food environments with foods that are specifically designed to be eaten, and very cleverly and effectively designed to be eaten, and to be eaten in large quantities. So our biology has evolved to deal with resistance against being eaten by foods, and now it's like pushing on a wall that isn't there. And you're bound to fall flat on your face because there is no resistance. Foods are beckoning to be eaten, like we see nowhere else in the wild.
Yeah, that's very well said. And it comes to the point of the environment, the politics, the lobbying, like with, pizza being declared a vegetable and so forth, that you really we're sort of fighting an uphill battle with our biology sort of behind the wheel, but not really, because someone else has taken the wheel, and that's the processed food companies. So what do you see as the way out for us as a society, as a world, when we've been diverted so deeply into this processed food industry, into the calories, into wanting pleasure from our food, and now knowing where we can get that feeling of pleasure of food, and it's not from the healthy, nutrient-dense, low-calorie food. So what do you see as a way out for us?
Well, the short-term and the long-term approaches to dealing with that. The short-term and the immediate thing that all of us can do is we understand what is driving the problem. It's the way that highly processed foods are marketed and they're formulated and not to be compatible with our biology. So the short-term fix, and this is what all successful weight loss or other healthy diets do, is to cut out or minimize the contribution of highly processed industrial foods to our diets. And we can't do that. We can't regulate or change in the short term our broader food environment, but our narrower, specific personal food environment we can. And that's the environment that we create around ourselves, such that when we're hungry, we choose foods to eat in our own homes. And so the way that I think about it is to shop with your brain, reduce the amount of that stuff that gets into your house, and then eat with your appetites. In the longer term, it's a massive challenge. That's a societal challenge. All of the evidence suggests that no single societal sector, like civil society, the individual, or government or industry can fix these types of problems. It has to be a coalition, a collaboration, a broader societal collaboration. And there have been successful precedents. Tobacco is one example.
Right.
Excessive salt intake in some countries, salt intake, which is a major killer, as you all know, has been reduced significantly, specifically through initiatives that have involved all three of those sectors. So the short-term and long-term approaches. And I do believe tobacco at least provides a precedent that suggests there is hope for dealing with this thing, but we need to approach it in a specific way.
It's a problem of dealing with a complex system, and that's we're sitting here in the Charles Perkins Centre. We've built this place precisely to do that. So